Of all the European colonies in Africa, there is one that holds a very dark place in history. The Congo Free State only existed between 1885 and 1908. During these 23 years, it was the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium. Whilst most colonies were owned and run by various countries, King Leopold held personal dominion over the lives of over 30 million people. Under Leopold's rule, these people suffered horrific mutilations as the king attempted to extract as much wealth as he could at the expense of countless lives. We will today shed a little light on the Congo Free State and explain how it was maybe the worst example of European colonialism in Africa. Belgium is a relatively new country, recognised in 1839. By this time, the major European powers of Britain, France and the Netherlands had already established themselves as colonial powers, whilst Germany and the United States of America were on the rise. The first king of Belgium, Leopold I, attempted successfully to obtain a colony for the young nation, believing it would be the best way to keep up with its neighbours. However, the general public view in Belgium was against obtaining a colony. His son Leopold II carried on his father's goal, but with particularly devious means. In 1876, Leopold established the International African Association, a charitable organisation with aims to, quote, civilise the largely unexplored Congo and to carry out religious missions to the region. But this was merely a cover for its colonial desires. Leopold realised that no other European nation was too interested in the Congo, despite the potential wealth in ivory identified by some explorers. Leopold approached the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley. Henry was asked to prepare the Congo for Belgian occupation. He had previously visited the Congo and had tried to petition the British government to lay their own claim, though the British were not too interested. Dejected, Stanley accepted Leopold's offer of employment. Around the same time, the explorer Pierre de Brazza was working on behalf of the French government to claim the land. The race was on to establish Leopold's interest in the Congo. A number of Belgian trading stations were created along the Congo River, as well as a number of fortified military posts. Stanley entered many treaties with various tribal chiefs in the Congo Basin, but these treaties were not understood by those who signed them and gave legal rights over the land to Leopold. More often than not, Stanley would employ trickery to convince the chiefs of the white man's power, including using a magnifying glass to light a cigar, declaring that if he so wished, he could harness the sun to burn down any of their villages. Between similar ploys to show the supposed supernatural powers of the white man and getting the chiefs to sign on gin, Stanley was able to obtain 500 land treaties. The goal of obtaining these treaties was to obtain legal ownership to the vast swathes of the Congo, at least in the eyes of the other European states. Despite this growth along the Congo River, Leopold insisted to his European neighbours that his intentions with the Congo was purely humanitarian, in particular, to rid the area of the various Arab Zanzibar slave traders operating in the region. He positioned himself as a friend to all, with the offer to no special treatment to any nation's access for trade. But, behind the scenes, he played each of the major powers against one another, gaining support for his ambitions from Germany and indifference from Britain. As a result, Leopold placed himself in a strong position in what is known as the Scramble for Africa. It was in November of 1884 that the infamous Berlin Conference took place. 14 of the major European powers and the United States of America met up to set the rules as to trade in the African continent, and roughly decide which countries would have a claim on the vast swathes of Africa. Not a single representative from any African nation was invited. Arbitrary boundaries were drawn up, as if with a ruler at times. There was no regard for the various cultures who would be impacted. In this scramble for Africa, the European powers laid their claim to the wealth of a continent and the lives of the African populations. But the key aim of the conference was as to the fate of the key trade routes and the Congo River and the Niger River. It was decided that these were to remain accessible to all for trade. Leopold accepted this, but was able to have his claim on most of the Congo officially recognised. Almost 1 million square miles, which contained around 30 million people. The Congo Free State was formed from this land in 1885, effectively under Leopold's direct control. To enforce his will, Leopold established the Force Publique, his own private army in the Congo. Many of the soldiers were African children captured at an early age and raised in the Catholic missions, brainwashed to become obedient soldiers. The force was supplemented with mercenaries from Zanzibar and handpicked from the Congolese men who were the fittest and strongest. These soldiers were forced to serve a minimum of 7 years. There were no black officers, with most of them being from Belgium and Northern Europe. The officers were young and inexperienced, but they were eager to engage in what they saw as an adventure. Many lacked any understanding of the native populations or the men they commanded. Originally, the force was used to deal with the Arab slave traders in the area, but in time, even the slave soldiers were forced into its ranks. Its role was soon changed to enforcing Leopold's greed and desire to make as much money as possible. As the absolute ruler of the Congo Free State, Leopold's ambition for wealth was finally realised in the demand for rubber. As the need for tyres for motorcycles and automobiles grew, so did the demand for rubber. Wild rubber plants were widely found in the Congo Basin, and so this was a key crop to be exploited, while the rest of the world attempted to build their own rubber plantations. With profits being the main concern for Leopold, entire villages would be forced to harvest the natural rubber, essentially as slave labour. Leopold passed a number of edicts in 1891 and 1892, mandating that all rubber had to be handed over to the state officials in an attempt to monopolise the crop. If a village refused to gather rubber, the Force Publique would often take hostages and burn homes to the ground. Examples would be made of any disobedience. Heads of the defiant men, women and children would be removed and displayed on the village palisades, often in the form of a cross as a warning for those who would dare cross the Congo Free State. The Congolese were expected to harvest impossibly high amounts of rubber in a day. This was arduous, dangerous work, with people climbing high into the trees to extract the natural rubber. One of the key tools used by the Force Publique to enforce the quota was the chicote. This was a whip made from hippopotamus hide, designed to flay the skin of the victim. The chicote would leave great rends in a person's back due to the dried skin of the whip having razor-sharp edges. It was a standard punishment to be whipped multiple times for failing to meet quotas, as much as 20 times. It was said that if you were whipped 50 times, it was a death sentence. If the soldiers of the Force Publique did not engage in such violence, they themselves would be killed. If multiple quotas were not met, the Force Publique were ordered to kill those who failed. As bullets were hard to come by, the soldiers were required to use one bullet to kill one person. In order to provide proof of the kill and proof that bullets were not wasted, soldiers were required to bring back a severed hand for each bullet fired. As baskets of rubber were brought back, so too were baskets of severed hands, and laid at the feet of European trading post commanders. As a result of this practice, severed hands became a form of currency. Instead of collecting just rubber, squads of the Force Publique would collect severed hands. Instead of just claiming the hands of the dead, the living too would be mutilated, and the hands of men, women and children were taken. There were even instances of villages fighting each other to gain severed hands from a rival tribe to supplement their rubber harvest. These brutal methods were no doubt effective, as by 1900 the Congo Free State had exported 6,000 tons of rubber, netting Leopold tens of millions in profit. As rubber and ivory were exported, very little food was imported to the Congo, only bullets, guns and barter goods. Despite Leopold's claims of ridding the Congo of the slave traders, slavery still existed and was carried out by the Congo Free State. One common target was women, who under the pretense of an imaginary crime would be arrested and kept in servitude for a minimum of 7 years. The state would then hire out the woman into sexual slavery to the highest bidder, the officers getting the first pick. Any child that was born as a result of these assaults would be considered property of the state. One of the biggest killers in the Congo Free State was disease. As the population was worked to exhaustion and starvation, disease ran rampant. One notable disease was the sleeping sickness, able to spread as trade exploded in the region. Smallpox and syphilis spread amongst the Congolese, brought in by European traders. As the marauding Force Publique went from village to village, they brought with them disease and spread the illnesses quickly, resulting in the deaths of thousands. In 1897, Leopold arranged for 267 Congolese to be brought to Belgium. The purpose was to recreate an average Congolese village for Belgians to witness. Leopold's goal was to garner support from the public for his colonial desires, and created exhibits of what the Congo had to offer. Leopold commissioned the building of 6 villages with the 267 Congolese forced to carry on as they would normally, only that now they would be behind fences for the Belgian public to gawk as the members of the Force Publique stood guard. As many as 40,000 people a day would come to visit the human zoo. As the Congo opened up to the outside world, the more people learned what was the cost of cheap rubber. In 1890, a man named George Washington William was able to visit the Congo. George was an American soldier, member of the Ohio House of Representatives, and a historian. Despite being initially impressed with Leopold following a meeting, he was appalled at what he witnessed. In response, he wrote an open letter to Leopold and set out what he had seen and what was done in Leopold's name. He saw the mutilations, the enslaved women, the indiscriminate murder, including an instance where 2 officers wagered on whether they could shoot a Congolese fisherman in his boat from the shore, and unfortunately, they could. And to quote the letter, 3 shots were fired and the native fell dead, pierced through the head, and the trade canoe was transformed into a funeral barge and floated silently down the river. The letter is filled with such extreme examples of barbarity. I will put a link to the full letter in the description, and I encourage you to take the time to read it. In 1902, a novel by the name Heart of Darkness was written by Joseph Conrad. Conrad had seen firsthand the horror of the rubber harvest working on a riverboat. The atrocities committed against the Congolese by white men behaving in ways they could not consider back home inspired his writings. The book is now famous for its anti-colonial message and its adaptation in the film Apocalypse Now. The character of Kurtz, the insane murderous ivory trader, is said to have been based on Leon Rom. Rom was a Belgian officer who worked for the Force Publique. He was known for decorating his flower bed with the severed heads of 21 Congolese people, and for keeping a set of gallows permanently in his office. In 1904, Alice Seeley Harris, a missionary who had been in the Congo since 1898, took over 1,000 photographs to document the horrors of the Congo Free State. The one that had the greatest impact was of Nesala, where he sits on the porch, sat in an almost fetal position, as he looks down at two items. On closer inspection, you realise it is a human hand and a human foot. These were taken from Boali, his 5-year-old daughter. Nesala failed to meet the quota set by the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company, so his daughter was killed by the company's militia. Her hand and foot were given to him as a grim reminder of the consequences of his failure. By 1908, the Belgian government stripped Leopold of his colony as a result of the international outcry against the crimes committed. But by this point, Leopold had already recovered his early investments and was now a very wealthy man. Leopold did not face any further scrutiny and died in 1909. But this was still not the end of the horrors for the Congolese, who now found themselves as subject to the Belgian government. Rubber workers now became miners, as the new colonial powers wanted to extract as much copper and gold as possible. Whilst infrastructure such as schools and churches were built in the Congo, there was an ulterior motive. The schools and churches preached that the black man was inferior to the colonial masters, who were there to guide the native populations. No higher education establishments were set up for the African populations, nor were they able to vote. These policies were designed to enforce the ideology that the white man needed to steer and look after the black man, as if he were a child. The groundwork carried out by Leopold II had devastating consequences for the Congo, the effects of which are still felt to this day. King Leopold's actions in the forming and running of the Congo Free State were driven solely by profit, with complete disregard for human life. In a conversation he had with Kaiser Wilhelm, Leopold commented that in the advent of democratic nations and the power of kings fading, all that the kings like them had left to do was make money. Leopold went to unbelievable lengths to gather wealth at the expense of millions. It is estimated that anywhere between 1 and 15 million people died during the 23 years of the Congo Free State. It is difficult to know the exact figure, as the deaths of the Congolese were never officially recorded and were of little concern. As long as the rubber and ivory still flowed, nothing else really mattered. Despite never setting foot in the Congo, Leopold's desire for wealth brutalized a nation and created a place where a man's darkest desires could be given free rein.